Okay, strap in, because today we are diving deep into Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd. This is going to be fascinating, and I have a feeling you wanted to go beyond just a simple summary of this book.
You're right. Going beyond the surface level is exactly what we are going to be doing today. Le Bon's work on crowd psychology, even though it was written in the late 1800s, is shockingly relevant even now.
Right. It really makes you think. So much has changed since then, but when you look at those core ideas about how people think and act when they are part of a group, well, it's like holding up this dusty old mirror to society, isn't it?
Exactly. It's amazing how many of Le Bon's observations about how being part of a crowd changes individual thinking still hold true today, both for the good and the bad.
I've got to say, even dipping my toes into the first few sections, I'm already seeing what you mean. He talks about this collective soul of a crowd, and it's kind of eerie how people get swept up in these shared beliefs, even if those beliefs don't really have a leg to stand on.
And that's precisely one of the things that fascinated Le Bon. It's like a crowd takes on a life of its own, becoming something more than just the sum of its parts with a distinct psychology separate from the individuals who make it up. And you're right, those shared beliefs can be based on anything from rational thought and evidence-based reasoning to, well, illusions.
That's like those emperor's new clothes situations, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Where everyone is going along with something because it's the thing to do, even if they secretly have their doubts.
precisely. Le Bon talks about the power of what he calls contagion in a crowd. Emotions and even behaviors can spread like wildfire. They're almost like a virus moving through a population.
So this contagion makes crowds incredibly vulnerable to manipulation, especially when you have a leader who knows how to play on those shared emotions.
Exactly. Whether it's preying on people's fears or appealing to their desires or even just tapping into prejudice that's already there.
And he seems to suggest that it doesn't matter how educated you are. Even the most highly educated individuals, once they become part of a crowd, are more likely to be influenced. It's a bit unnerving, don't you think?
You're hitting on one of Le Bon's most intriguing points. Education doesn't equal rationality, especially not when it comes to crowds. He argues there are even situations where more education might make people more susceptible to manipulation.
Especially maybe when those highly educated people feel like they aren't being listened to, or that the system is failing them in some way.
Precisely, and that is exactly where the role of leaders comes in. It's something that Le Bon really dives into in his work.
It's a fascinating section of the book, for sure. He seems to believe that some people just have this inherent it factor, this sort of natural charisma or prestige that makes them incredibly persuasive, especially to crowds. Didn't he use Napoleon as an example?
He did. Le Bon seemed to be captivated by these figures that he referred to as leaders of crowds, and he dedicated a significant portion of his work to unpacking how these leaders acquire and then utilize their influence. But you're right, it's not about military strength or anything like that. It's much more psychological. Some people just seem to have this intangible power over others.
And it's not just about having that it factor either. He also talked about specific strategies that these leaders use. Things like repetition or strong imagery, anything that really sticks with you long after you've heard it.
Exactly. There's like those political slogans that get stuck in your head, even if you don't support the politician who came up with them.
Exactly. They're designed that way.
Right. And Le Bon was writing during a time when understanding how to persuade large groups of people was becoming increasingly important, and his work was groundbreaking in that it broke down the mechanics of persuasion, explaining how appealing to emotion, simplifying language, and repeating core messages were incredibly effective ways to exert influence over a crowd.
And he actually called out some of these tactics directly, right? Like using what he called affirmation, which is just repeating the same thing over and over, and contagion, which is this idea that emotions are infectious.
Yes. And while he might not have used today's terminology, his observations are shockingly relevant to things we see everywhere, every day, from propaganda to marketing, and even just the way things play out on social media.
You know, it really makes you think because it's almost like our brains are hardwired to be influenced this way, especially in large groups.
That's one of the things that makes Le Bon's work so compelling and, let's be honest, a little bit frightening.
Yeah.
It suggests that our vulnerability to this kind of crowd influence is deeply ingrained in our psychology.
Like it's hardwired into us.
Right, potentially even a holdover from our evolutionary past.
It's pretty wild when you think about it. Our world now with social media and this constant barrage of advertising and the 24/7 news cycle, it's almost as if we're all living in one giant psychology experiment.
I think that's a pretty accurate way to look at it, actually. I think that Le Bon's work serves as a very potent reminder that while crowds can be incredibly powerful agents of change, they can also be incredibly vulnerable to manipulation. They can be led to make decisions that aren't in their best interest at all.
And Le Bon doesn't just talk about crowds in a general sense either. He gets into specifics. He talks about criminal crowds, juries, even voters.
Right, he sees crowd psychology at play in all these different aspects of society.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
It's like no group is immune.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that makes his work so relevant even today, more than a century after he wrote it. He argues that all of these seemingly disparate groups, when they come together as a crowd, they display very similar patterns in their psychology.
He's not pulling any punches either when he talks about how susceptible these groups are to manipulation, or how often the choices they make are based more on emotion than they are on logic. Like, he uses the example of juries being swayed by a witness who's crying on the stand or by a group of experts, even if their testimony isn't all that reliable when you look at it objectively.
Right, and he connects those different types of crowds by looking at them through this lens of shared psychology, right? So he's saying that it doesn't really matter what the context is, whether you're talking about a courtroom or a political rally or even just a group of friends. The basic psychological mechanisms of crowd behavior, they remain strikingly similar.
And then, when he starts talking about voters,
Yeah.
he says they're very easily swayed by things like a leader's prestige or using powerful rhetoric and those appeals to emotion.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
Because it really speaks to the enduring relevance of Le Bon's work. Crowds, whether they're physically gathered in a single location or whether they're expressing themselves through something like a vote, are still susceptible to all of these basic psychological influences.
Which sort of leads to this bigger question. I mean, after reading this, you have to wonder, are we all just destined to be puppets of these charismatic leaders and their appeals to our emotions? Is there any hope of ever being able to make rational choices in a world where it feels like this crowd mentality is becoming more and more dominant?
I think that's the question that Le Bon leaves us grappling with. He certainly seems to be suggesting that while crowds have this immense power, that they're also incredibly open to being manipulated.
Not exactly a comforting thought, is it?
It isn't. And he doesn't exactly let us off the hook by giving us easy answers either. He just encourages us to be more aware of these dynamics at play, to try to be more critical thinkers, to question the information that we're being bombarded with. And I think maybe most importantly, to be aware of all the different influences that are shaping our perceptions, especially when we find ourselves in a group setting.
So it's kind of like that old saying, know thyself, but maybe with an addendum, know thyself and know the crowd.
I like that. I think that's a great way to put it. The more we understand how crowd psychology works, how all of these little mechanisms of influence play out on us psychologically, the more we can start to navigate even really complex social situations without getting swept away.
He also talks about crowds going through very distinct phases, doesn't he? There's that buildup, this intensity that kind of peaks, and then eventually a decline.
He does. Le Bon describes this fascinating progression in his book, talking about how crowds form, how they become increasingly unified in their beliefs and their emotions, and then finally how they eventually disperse. And it's really interesting because he uses all of this vivid imagery.
Yeah, and he compares these groups of people to organisms. He says they're like a living thing, going through their own life cycle.
Exactly. For example, in one passage, he talks about how crowds in their early stages are highly suggestible and impulsive, almost like children. He really drives this point home by using really vivid language and imagery.
And then he talks about how those early influences, those initial sparks, can really determine the direction a crowd takes.
Precisely. And it highlights how important it is to be able to recognize these patterns early on.
But, aside from that life cycle of a crowd, he also spends quite a bit of time examining how the anonymity that often comes from being part of a crowd, how that can either fuel certain behaviors.
Right. It's like people start to feel less inhibited, less accountable for their individual actions when they're just one face in the crowd.
Right. Like the normal rules of behavior are suspended, at least for a little while.
Exactly. And that's a really crucial observation that Le Bon makes. He argues that the anonymity of being in a crowd can lead to what he calls a diffusion of responsibility. People feel less restricted by their usual morals or social boundaries.
Which, let's be honest, can lead to those really ugly mob mentality situations where there's violence, but it can also lead to incredible displays of selflessness and even heroism.
You're exactly right. It's a double-edged sword.
It is.
And Le Bon acknowledges that. He says crowds are capable of both incredible good and incredible bad, And it really all just depends on the circumstances, what those initial triggers are, and the other influences that are at play in that moment.
Thinking back on the book, one of the things that has really stuck with me is this idea that he puts forth that the most effective leaders, they're not always the smartest people in the room. They're not always the ones who are thinking the most rationally or logically. Often they're the people who understand at a fundamental level how to persuade others, how to tap into those emotional undercurrents and really leverage them.
Right. Le Bon observed that a lot of times the most successful leaders when it came to crowds, they were really masters of reading and then manipulating people's emotions. They were masters of being able to create these really simple but really powerful narratives that resonate on this deep, almost visceral level, and then they use that to motivate people to take action.
So it's almost like in a crowd setting, logic and careful reasoning,
Yeah.
they take a backseat to emotion and instinct.
That seems to be very much what Le Bon believed. He saw crowds as being primarily driven by unconscious desires and emotions, which in his view made them particularly vulnerable to those leaders who understood how to tap into those primal forces that are at play.
Another thing that I thought was really interesting that really struck me was just how important Le Bon believed things like imagery and symbolism are when you're talking about crowds.
Absolutely. You're right. He observed over and over that crowds are incredibly responsive to those strong visual cues, to those easily recognizable symbols and potent metaphors. And he really firmly believed that those things could be far more persuasive than any logical argument or factual data.
It's like those images, those symbols, they become the sort of shorthand for this whole complex web of beliefs and values that are really difficult to put into words sometimes, but people, they just feel it so intensely.
Yes. And that is precisely what makes them such powerful tools for mobilizing crowds and for creating a sense of shared identity. It really bypasses the need for complex reasoning and speaks directly to our emotional core. It taps into those primal instincts that we all share.
So if we try to connect all of this back to the big picture, what does it all mean for us now? I mean, it's not like we're all just running around following charismatic leaders with torches and pitchforks, but it does feel like these dynamics that Le Bon was talking about are at play everywhere you look.
They really are. I think what Le Bon's work really highlights for us is how important it is to be very critical consumers of information, especially in this day and age.
Especially now, yeah.
Right. I mean, think about it. Every day we are absolutely bombarded with messages and narratives and people trying to grab our attention.
This is true.
And a lot of these things are deliberately designed to play on our emotions.
And to get around that logical part of our brain.
Exactly. They want to bypass all that and just go straight for the gut in order to influence how we behave.
So we really need to be aware of what's going on. We need to be able to recognize those techniques that are being used against us, whether we encounter them in advertising or in politics or even just scrolling through social media.
Right, exactly. And the great thing is that even though he was writing more than 100 years ago, Le Bon gives us this incredible framework for understanding how those techniques work.
Which then helps us to be more discerning about the information we're taking in.
Right. We can start to recognize which messages we should be more skeptical of and which ones we should allow ourselves to internalize.
One thing I've been thinking about is this whole concept of prestige that Le Bon talks about. He seems to believe that certain people, even institutions or ideas, they just kind of have this aura of authority around them.
Yes.
And it's amazing how much that can influence what other people think.
It is. And Le Bon argues that this prestige, it can come from all sorts of places. It could be somebody's reputation, their social status, things they've accomplished in life, even just, their charisma.
And it's like we're almost hardwired to give more weight to the opinions of those figures or those ideas without ever really stopping to think why.
That's precisely what makes prestige such a powerful force. It really does operate on this subconscious level, totally bypassing our rational filters, appealing instead to this primal instinct to follow the people that we see as being above us in some way.
And Le Bon recognized that this could be used for good or for evil, right?
No, absolutely. It's not inherently a force for good or a force for bad.
Right.
He gives historical examples of both.
So he can inspire people to do incredibly courageous things.
Yes.
Amazing acts of selflessness, but it's also been used to justify some truly terrible things.
It has.
Oppression, discrimination, even violence.
Unfortunately, that's right.
So it's really just this tool that's always been there, this ability to influence large groups of people through perceived authority.
Yes.
And I guess that's why understanding how it works is essential, especially now when information can spread like wildfire and it feels like everyone is competing for our attention.
Absolutely. And the good news is that Le Bon provides us with that framework. And it's up to each and every one of us to take that framework and use it for the forces of good.
Yeah, exactly. We can be more discerning,
We can.
more conscious of how those dynamics are playing out around us every single day.
That's right.
And, it occurs to me that all of this deep dive into Le Bon's work, it's about so much more than just crowds in that literal sense, isn't it?
It is.
It's really about understanding ourselves as social creatures.
It is.
How we all fit into this broader fabric of different groups.
Yeah.
And how that ends up shaping what we believe and how we choose to act in the world.
You've hit the nail on the head. It really is a reflection on human nature, on our social instincts and how susceptible we are to having our beliefs, our choices, our very behaviors shaped by these really potent forces, especially when we're part of something larger than ourselves.
And that feels particularly relevant right now when you look at the political landscape in so many parts of the world. The way that certain figures use rhetoric and imagery, those massive rallies that feel almost electric. It's almost like you can see what Le Bon was talking about playing out on our TV screens and all over social media.
It's true, and that's what makes his writing so fascinating to return to. His observations, the things he was writing about more than 100 years ago, they're just as applicable to the world we live in today. They give us this really valuable framework for understanding things like how political movements take hold and the mechanisms by which propaganda actually works, the ways that leaders capture the imaginations of the public.
And it's so often the leaders who come from within those groups, right?
Very often, yes.
Like they understand instinctively the hopes and fears and frustrations that already exist within that population, and then they tap into that energy.
Exactly. They don't create these strong emotions out of thin air. They act as a mirror, reflecting back what people are already feeling, but in this really amplified, emotionally charged way.
Right. So it's almost like they're giving a voice to, and maybe a direction to, all these feelings that were already simmering under the surface.
Exactly.
Wow. So where does that leave us when it comes to individual responsibility? I mean, are we really just passive players in all of this, or do we actually have the ability to assert our own agency and make our own decisions, even when we're caught up in this kind of group setting?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
I think that Le Bon very much believed that while every single one of us is susceptible to crowd influence to some extent...
It's part of what it means to be human.
Right. It's part of our nature. That doesn't mean that we're powerless.
So there is a glimmer of hope.
I think there is. He seems to suggest that through things like education and really working to hone our critical thinking skills, that if we can develop a stronger awareness of our own psychological vulnerabilities, especially in group settings, we can become much more resilient. We're less likely to just be completely swept away.
So the more we understand these dynamics that are at play, the more we'll be able to make conscious, informed choices.
Exactly, and that's the goal, right? It's about developing that higher level of awareness that allows us to navigate all the complexities of these group dynamics without losing ourselves, without losing sight of who we are as individuals, or giving up our ability to make our own decisions that align with our values.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
This has been incredibly eye-opening for me, I've got to say. It's given me a lot to think about. It really changes the way that I view my own experiences in crowds and groups, all of it.
It is a different lens, isn't it?
It really is. I'm going to be looking at things very differently from now on. And, I think this is something that everybody should be thinking about.
I agree.
Especially now in this day and age when we're dealing with information overload
Yeah.
and everybody and their brother is trying to influence us to get us to buy something or think a certain way or vote a certain way.
I agree. Le Bon's work, it really equips us with the tools we need to better understand ourselves, to better understand the world around us, and most importantly, I think, to better understand how to navigate this tricky territory of being part of a larger group, which includes those physical crowds, but also those virtual crowds that we find ourselves in almost constantly now.
It's true. Well, this has been an amazing deep dive. Thank you so much for all of that. And to all of you listening out there, I encourage you to take these ideas and continue to explore them. Le Bon's work, it's full of these really incredible insights that are every bit as relevant today as they were more than a century ago. And I think we can all agree that as we navigate this increasingly complex world, understanding the psychology of crowds, it isn't just interesting, it's absolutely essential.